Hello, runners, and welcome back to the Scotiabank Toronto Waterfront Marathon virtual speaker series. My name is Kate Van Buskirk, and today I am joined by Janice Forsyth. Janice, I feel badly. I didn't ask you, is it Forsyth or Forsyth?
It's Forsyth, no E. So it's,
Great.
yeah, people often ask how to pronounce it, Forsyth.
And I should have done that to begin with, but Janice Forsyth, it's lovely to have you with us. Janice is an advocate for Indigenous sport in Canada. She's a former athlete and an associate professor in sociology, as well as the director of Indigenous Studies at Western University's Faculty of Social Science. She is a member of the Fisher River Cree Nation and the author of the recently published book, Reclaiming Tom Longboat, Indigenous Self-Determination in Canadian Sport. Thank you so much for joining us today, Janice. How are you?
I'm great, and thank you for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate it.
Well, we're thrilled that you were able to join us. We're here to talk about your book, amongst other things. This book just came out this year, and we'll get into that in a moment. But just to start, I'd love to get to know you a little better. You call yourself a former athlete, but you were quite successful in that role. Can you take us back and tell us more about your own athletic background?
I think, first of all, just a quick correction. The book came out last year. Just
Oh,
as
I
soon as
apologize.
that's okay. Just as soon as the pandemic hit, and so it went under the radar for a lot of different reasons. I've always done sport, organized sport. My grandmother was a real advocate for that, and our family didn't have a lot of money, and she saved up all of her money. She worked as a cleaner in the local hotels, and saved up all of her money and gave it to my parents. And so I was kind of like the odd duck out in sports. I was the poor kid doing all of the rich kid sports, doing ballet, horseback riding, figure skating. And then after she passed away and the money was no longer coming in, I'd also realized I wasn't really interested in doing those kind of sports, the gendered sports, very feminine, and picked up cross country running and badminton. And that's what carried me into university. So when I was at Western doing my undergraduate degree, I completed on three sports, the varsity badminton, cross country, and track and field team. It kept me really busy. I would literally be rolling off the bus, from a track meet or a cross country meet, and running over to the stadium to play badminton the next day. And so all of my accomplishments really were because of varsity sports. It got me to where I needed to be. And some of my proudest accomplishments are in the Indigenous sports sector, having competed at the North American Indigenous Games.
That's fantastic. And I'm curious about how your own athletic background may have shaped your interest in perhaps writing this book, or at least in learning more about Tom Longboat, because in my research, I believe, Janice, that you were actually the recipient of the Regional Tom Longboat Award based on your athletic accolades. Maybe you can tell us more about that.
Sure. I think like a lot of researchers, especially Indigenous researchers, we come to our research and what we do through our own personal experiences, and that's definitely my experience. So when I was doing my undergraduate degree in history, and also doing sport at the same time, I was trying to figure out how to marry the two. And at the time, historians didn't take sport seriously, and I didn't quite know what to do with my sporting background, because I didn't have the experience to go into kinesiology, and that wasn't even a field at the time. It was still physical education. So I ended up at Western's International Center for Olympic Studies in the kinesiology program for my graduate degree, and just kind of happened to fall into it. Married the two, sport, Indigenous history, and just kept going. There was not much of a field, so I was like a few people just kind of paving the way, trying to figure out where we go. And as far as Tom Longboat is concerned, I'd known about Tom Longboat growing up, didn't know much about him, and then started taking a look at his story when I got into graduate school, and trying to learn more about his representation. Like, how do we talk about Tom Longboat and what can we reasonably say about Tom Longboat based on the evidence that we had. I mean, I'd done papers in my undergraduate degree on other Indigenous athletes, but just my fascination with Tom Longboat came about when I was doing my graduate work. So I'd always known about him, but then I really started to focus on how we talk about him and how we remember him in my graduate years.
I think it's fair to say that almost every Canadian and certainly Ontarian runner knows has at least heard of Tom Longboat. There's races named after him, running clubs named after him. I live downtown Toronto, right around the corner from Tom Longboat Hall, which is a beautiful structure there where he trained towards the Boston Marathon. And Janice, in the early part of your book, you sort of prepare the reader that the book is not necessarily going to be about Tom Longboat. It's about other themes and perhaps deeper relationships to him. But maybe we can start by making sure that our audience really understands who he was. Who was Tom Longboat?
Yeah, so a funny story is when I was defending my PhD and doing the public lecture on the Tom Longboat Awards, it was a full audience, and some of the audience members were older gentlemen, and I remember one gentleman in the background saying very loudly, because he had a hearing aid and he didn't know how loud he was talking. He said, "That was a great presentation, but who is Tom Longboat?" And it occurred to me that people might have heard the name, but they, like you said, they don't know who he is. So Longboat was an Onondaga runner from the Six Nations of the Grand River, and that's not too far from Hamilton, to situate it for people who might know that kind of a location. It's in southern Ontario, and Six Nations is one of the larger First Nations communities in Canada, and located fairly close to Toronto. And they had a lot of fantastic athletes coming out of there from the 1800s, early 1900s. And he was a long distance runner, foot racer at the time, pedestrianism, as they would have called it back in the 1900s. And back then, foot racing was huge. It was just, one of the most popular sports. And he was one of the most popular athletes known worldwide. If Tom Longboat was around, he would attract hundreds and thousands of spectators, and people would come out just to watch him race. Partly because he was so good, but also because of his Indianness, because he was, an attraction. And of course, the people who were organizing the races knew this, and so they would promote, Tom Longboat being there. But he was an extraordinary athlete. He had incredible range. He could run anything from, the mile to the marathon in fantastic times, and times that would still resonate today. He was also the subject of overt and systemic racism. Of course, being Indigenous, I would hope that a lot of listeners understand now, because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the kind of challenges that Indigenous people faced and still face. But back then, it was overt. As trainer and manager at the time, and other people involved in his life, managing his life, would berate him for being an Indian, and call on all of his stereotypes in order to describe him, and then at the same time hold him up as a role model. And so you put yourself in the position of Tom Longboat, and you try and imagine what it was like trying to be Tom Longboat in that kind of a context where he was never given a say. Like there are no public records that we know of that tell Longboat's side of the story, how he felt about these things, what he was thinking, how he was managing the different ways he was encountering racism. And it must have been extraordinary. So from that point of view, Tom Longboat was also incredibly adept. You had to be in order to navigate those channels as well as he did. As far as I can tell too, he was a consummate gentleman. If he had lashed out, it certainly wasn't reported in the press. And chances are, if he had lashed out, it would have come across very badly in the press. They would have, hounded him. And so he maintained his composure, and his culture throughout his entire life. So it really is an extraordinary story of about Tom Longboat. And from my point of view, as someone who's Indigenous but also a scholar, it's also really frustrating, because generally what we only hear about Tom Longboat is how good of an athlete he was, but it's his story that is really extraordinary. All of the things that aren't said publicly, I think is really, what makes Tom Longboat Tom Longboat.
Thank you for that. And one of the things that strikes me is, especially as he was coming into his fame, he was such a young man. I mean, he won the Boston Marathon, I think, when he was 19 or 20 in 1907. So, he was navigating these really horrific depictions in some cases, but also doing it in sort of a really fast rise to stardom, and as such a young man. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because you talk about how he was perceived and received by the press as being sort of both lauded for his successes. Again, he won around the Bay, he won the Boston Marathon, set the Boston Marathon record by, I think, 5 minutes. He competed in the Olympics and set multiple Canadian records throughout his career. But in the same time that he was being lauded by the press, they were also drawing on these racist stereotypes to tell his story. And that is a piece that I certainly had never known about him or heard of. And I think, to your point, it sounds like that was part of the inspiration for writing the book, because very few people probably knew that outside of perhaps scholars like yourself who took that on. This is a good time to talk about the Tom Longboat Awards, because I think some of that, it being applauded for success and then also sort of beaten down by stereotypes seems to be mirrored in the Tom Longboat Awards. Can you tell us about their creation?
Yeah, so it's there's certainly a lot of parallels to Tom Longboat's story back in the early 1900s. And then the history of the Tom Longboat Awards, as well as the athletes who carry on his legacy, the recipients of today, and them not having platforms to speak, or having their stories told in ways that are certainly more nuanced and more complex. But back to the Tom Longboat Awards. So when Tom Longboat died in 1949, 2 years after his death, there's a man by the name of Jan Eisenhart, and he was actually a friend of mine. He created the Tom Longboat Awards when he was working at the Department of Indian Affairs. He had been hired in 1950 and started working there in 1951. And he himself has quite a storied career, Jan Eisenhart. But anyway, all to say, he started working at Indian Affairs in 1951. And at that point in time, Indian Affairs was undergoing changes, policy changes, revising its Indian Act. And the Indian Act is a piece of legislation that overarches all Indigenous lives in Canada. It's the cradle to the grave piece of legislation. And it was undergoing revisions. And one of the things that Indian Affairs wanted to do was use sport and recreation to encourage assimilation. So they created a new portfolio within their department, and hired Jan as supervisor of physical education and recreation. And he himself had a fascination with Tom Longboat. And so digging through Jan Eisenhart's archives, he had, a lot of original documents about, copies of original documents about Tom Longboat. So he was kind of like a de facto historian. And it was very clear going through that Eisenhart had done his own research. And so he wanted to create an award in memory of Tom Longboat because of his own fascination with the athlete. But also, just like we all are, we're all products of our own age. Eisenhart reproduced, some of the stereotypes that were still dominant at the time. And then the problem was, because it was Indian Affairs, and Indian Affairs is well known for its genocidal history. This idea got picked up by Indian Affairs and got wrapped up into the Tom Longboat Awards. So we have this award then in 1951 that is ostensibly meant to celebrate Tom Longboat's accomplishments, but at the same time, it's being used to encourage assimilation or cultural genocide of athletes into the mainstream system. So the awards were broadcast, circulated through the residential schools, through the day schools, and also on reserves, and celebrating Indigenous athletes who were doing really well in mainstream sports. Right. So it wasn't about celebrating, of course, Indigenous accomplishments and Indigenous sports. It was all about assimilation. So, so we have this, really complex story that Tom, was living through, which we don't know much about because again, Tom never left his own story. Being picked up and celebrated through the Tom Longboat Awards. And then we have Indian Affairs and what was then the Amateur Athletic Union of Canada, the governing body for amateur sport at the time, or at least one of them. Then they managed the awards up until 1972, 73, 74. So for about 22 to 24 years, they're in control of the awards. So it's got this really complicated history. And the other thing that's really important about the Tom Longboat Awards is that usually sport awards are created by sport organizations, because that's what they do and they want to celebrate their own. This is the only award that we know of either in Canada or the Commonwealth that was created by government, because it was Indian Affairs that created the award, and then the Amateur Athletic Union of Canada decided to support the award. So you have to ask yourself, why would government create a sport award, in 1951? What was going on at the time that was so important that it would actually put its energies towards this? And it's even more important, of course, that it's Indian Affairs. It's not, another branch of the government. It's Indian Affairs that's coming out with this.
Sorry, I think you froze just for a second there as you were starting to describe this, but you touched on something I was going to ask you, which of course is, this was clearly not meant to be really a sport award, but rather a political tool. You talked about that. And this is where I think we just froze for a minute, but maybe you could tell us a little more about the various eras of the administration of the Tom Longboat Award, because I think, you take us through this progression of the different groups that kind of took over its administration and how eventually Indigenous peoples came to reclaim this award and transform its meaning.
Yeah, so it's sport awards aren't often taken seriously, and yet they're ubiquitous, right? They're I think everybody globally can talk about some form of sport award that they won at a certain point in their life. But they're also political tools, and especially in this case, as you said. And so it makes sense then, because it's politically important that different groups would want to have control over the awards. So from 1951 to about 1972, 1974, we have Indian Affairs and the Amateur Athletic Union of Canada overseeing the giving out of the award. And they collaborate closely with the missionaries, the Indian agents, the people who are in the schools and running them on a day-to-day basis, as well as some sport officials, in order to hand out the award. So they identify who the award winners are, and then they hand out the award. And this is done throughout Canada, because the award is given regionally in each province and territory of Canada. And then from those pool of regional recipients, it would have been the Amateur Athletic Union of Canada that would have determined the award winner from that pool. And then with the emergence of Indigenous political activism in the 1960s, and then especially in the 1970s, when they're looking to gain control over Indian education, so Indian control of Indian education, and the emergence of treaties and sovereignty becomes a big discussion point in the 1960s and 1970s, as Indigenous war veterans are coming back and talking about the inequities that they face. And one of the things that they wanted to try and do was broadcast their messages about their own ideas of self-determination, and they use sport to do this. So we actually see Indigenous political groups, and especially the National Indian Brotherhood, vying for control of the award, and they get control of the award in the 1970s. And so they then become part of the process in the 1970s, along with the Canadian Amateur Sports Federation, because Canadian sport undergoes a lot of changes over the years as well. And then they have more control over the meaning of the award. And then at some point in time in the 1980s, The Canadian sports organizations just drop out of the awards. They're no longer interested in them. And it becomes an overt political tool managed by what then becomes the Assembly of First Nations. So if you're a Canadian and you know Indigenous politics or politics, you might have heard of the Assembly of First Nations. And then in the 1990s, when Indigenous sport becomes a full thing unto itself, this is when we see the Aboriginal Sports Circle requesting and being given control as custodians of the award from the Assembly of First Nations in the 1990s. And the meanings change, throughout the years, because of course the awards are symbols, they're vehicles that you can broadcast messages with. And so it changes over the years depending on who's organizing it and controlling it.
It's interesting for me to think about what Tom Longboat might think were he alive today. I mean, to know that his legacy has carried on and changed in so many ways and been used in so many ways for a lot of different desires, and as almost sort of weaponized in some ways and then reclaimed. It's fascinating to think about. And I mean, we won't have an answer to that, but it's striking me that for someone's name to be attached to something like this means a lot, right?
It definitely does. And I think it's just really interesting because Tom Longboat has almost seen a revival in the last year or two. There's, my book, of course, but also I know because people, reach out to me, letting me know what's going on. And there's more initiatives coming forward about Tom Longboat. And it's just so interesting because in a way, I think Tom Longboat has become more important than he ever was, before. He's become like a new symbol again, especially as, in Canada, at least, COVID has, made it very clear about the inequities, among different groups of people, including Indigenous people. And then we have in Canada, again, the unmarked graves that came to light for most Canadians earlier this year, even though we've known about it, for quite a few years, because the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out with a report in 2015 about the missing children in unmarked graves. But Tom Longboat, again, I think has become a symbol, especially in sport, where people want to think that sport is a force for good, if you will, that it's a positive thing, in people's lives. And to that I say, well, I mean, it can be true, but it's also far more complex than that. Because again, if you take a look at something like Tom Longboat's experience, it is way more complex and nuanced than is often told publicly. You take a look at the Tom Longboat Awards, and it's not just a celebration of Indigenous excellence in sport, it's also a celebration of assimilation. And so it's just really interesting to see this revival, right? This interest in Tom Longboat. It's like if people are grasping for something that they need to make meaning, out of their lives. And Tom Longboat is serving that purpose again.
I should just mention the reason that I'm in a hotel room is I'm here in Boston for the 125th running of the Boston Marathon this year. And I haven't seen it in person yet because I haven't been to the finish line, but I had some Canadian friends posting photos of a beautiful display and I think like a commemoration of Tom Longboat here at the Boston Marathon. And I think part of that is, again, the fact that it's 125th running. So there's maybe a revival of some of the past winners, but I'll be very curious to see that. But yes, I agree. I think that there's been certainly I think his name is on a lot more tongues than it maybe was in the last several decades. Yeah. Another question that you ask in the book is, what would the award mean to the recipients? And I'm curious about what you discovered and learned as you were researching and tracking down all of these previous recipients, because that sounds like it was, first of all, a huge amount of work, but also something no one else had done before.
Yeah, well, it's funny because and I talk about this in the book, it started off as a work project. In 2000, I was actually working for the Aboriginal Sports Circle, and I had moved to Cornwall, working in Akwesasne, and the board of directors were sitting around the table, and people were wondering who the previous recipients were, because they didn't know. They had at the time kind of found and hauled out the trophy itself, which now sits in Canada's Sport Hall of Fame in Calgary. But at the time, it was, buried under a mountain of other stuff, apparently at the National Exhibition in Toronto. And on the trophy are those little nameplates, right, that you often see, and they get them engraved and then they stick them on the plate, and some had fallen off, so they'd just gone missing and they hadn't updated them since the 1970s or 80s or whatever, and it was just lying in this back of a warehouse. And so I took it on as a work project, just like, okay, well, let's just like see what can happen. And so this work project actually morphed into my PhD. And because, if you do history work, you'll know that it's not just as simple as going to an archive, pulling out a box and saying, oh, there's the list of all of the names. I had to find out where the archives might be. They're never just in one spot, and then try and, find out like if anybody has any other, memory, oral history of some of the missing pieces. So it initially started out as a work project, and through that process, you mentioned earlier that I was a recipient of the Tom Longboat Award, the regional award for Ontario in 2002, and so that actually got me very interested in what it was like to be a recipient, because and that's a different story. Like, that's a very personal journey for me. When I got the award, it came in the mail, and I remember looking at the award, and it's actually sitting on my desk right there. I just remember thinking, wow, like being recognized from the quote unquote community that way, that was something else. Like I'd won a lot of accolades as an athlete. And so, I was no stranger to receiving awards, but this one just stopped me in my tracks. And I thought, like, first of all, I just, cried, because it's, getting that kind of recognition is, more meaningful than anything I can express, especially when you think about the history of disenfranchisement and how, families and communities get split apart. So there was that element, but there was also the element of having done enough homework at that point in time. It was 2 years into this work project and in my PhD, and knowing the history, a little bit about the history, that it was, a tool for assimilation. I thought, how do I feel about this award? And then what does it mean for me now, to carry on as a Tom Longboat recipient? I wondered, am I challenging, assimilation, or am I reproducing it? Or, is it much more complex than that? And because I couldn't have this conversation with myself, I had this idea that I would go and interview other recipients. So I, reached out and did as many interviews as I possibly could without any funding. And that's how those got started. And since then, I've interviewed about 50 people. Some of the award winners going back to 1950, in 1951, the origins of the award. And I still have to write about that. But that's where that whole idea came from. It was really just, part of my ongoing kind of personal journey and my own fascination. And their stories were so complex. Like, and that really just goes back to the point about, what we don't really know about Tom Longboat. Because when you're sitting down with the recipients and you're spending time, with them, talking about their experiences in sport, the different ways as well, it was gendered and racist and ableist, and, what it meant to them and their community. How did their community celebrate it along with them? Who recognized them, and how did it feel to be recognized by that person and not this person? And so on and so on. It was just, it's really fascinating, just the complex ways Indigenous people understood the award.
The award has evolved and changed so much, as you've described. And again, I think it's fair to say that there have been some parallels there with how the sporting landscape in general has changed for Indigenous peoples over the last several decades. I know this is a really big question. It's so much of what your work revolves around, and I'm sure we could do a whole other talk just on this, but I'm wondering at this point in time in 2021, how you're feeling about the other major strides that need to be taken in our current sporting landscape, not only to make it more equitable, but to continue this process of reconciliation and self-reclamation.
I think, well, one of the things that I point out in my book is the ongoing silence that Indigenous athletes face. And this is partly just because of the way, media works as well, because athletes are often in the spotlight, for their athletic accomplishments. And then there is some sort of mention, of their life story in order to create, some sort of feeling between the reader and the athlete to help, make it a life story more attractive to the readers. And part of my argument is, this does a disservice, I think, to the complexity of their lives. I mean, it's good fodder for, for sports media, but I think sports media and just media in general has a lot of work to do in terms of trying to understand how to report on athletes' lives, especially Indigenous athletes' lives. I've seen a lot of really good reporting, not a lot of, but more good reporting come out in the last couple of years. But I still think there's like a long way to go. I also think in Canada, I think a lot of people don't realize how many sport organizations there are in Canada. There's hundreds, like hundreds of them. And all of them are trying, not all of them, but many of them are trying to do something around reconciliation. And that makes it really difficult as an Indigenous sport organization to do something meaningful in the area with all of these kind of scattered approaches to reconciliation. So I would say if Canada could do one thing, it would be create a national strategy for sport and reconciliation that would serve as guidelines for sport organizations wanting to do better, and perhaps even media as well. I've in my experience, I think a lot of people have, they want to do really good work, but they just don't know what to do. And in order to do something, because they are also compelled to do something oftentimes with their funding, they take a step forward, and it may not necessarily be, a step forward that actually helps the Indigenous sports sector and Indigenous athletes. So I think basically those are the two things that need to be done. One is a better reporting, a more fuller, complex, nuanced stories, and also a national strategy for Indigenous sport in Canada.
Thank you for sharing that, Janice.
Thanks.
I know that we've taken up a lot of your time, but I feel like I could speak with you about this forever. As folks are reading your book, because of course everyone needs to rush out and buy Reclaiming Tom Longboat. It's a beautiful read. We've covered a lot of different themes, and it goes through a tremendous history of Canada, of the man, of this Indigenous and settler relationships and context. As folks are reading, are there one or two sort of main takeaways that you hope, or additions to Tom's legacy that you hope will come out of this for the readership more broadly?
Yeah, again, I think the silence is really important. I think as people are celebrating Tom Longboat and wanting to, remember him, I think that's really important because, these kind of remembrances keep names and issues like on the table and at the forefront. But it's also really important to remember that he was much more than an athlete who did incredible things. He was an Indigenous man who was, trying to circumnavigate the colonialism, at the time. And that's the story I think that we need to understand better. So it wasn't just that he triumphed over the different forms of oppression that he faced and that Indigenous people still continue to face. He dealt with them in really complex ways that we'll never understand. So I think it's really important that or that we can never fully know. But I think it's important for people to think about that because then I think when you develop that kind of empathy, that kind of understanding, then you will see that many of those challenges still exist today. So it's not that, Indigenous athletes often face the same kind of racist reporting that Tom Longboat did, although there are elements of that for sure. It's just that the challenges have morphed into new forms of colonialism that that we still need to address. So I think remembering Tom Longboat is also about reclaiming that history of understanding the spaces that he had to operate in, at the same time that people can celebrate his tremendous athletic accomplishments, because he was phenomenal by all accounts.
Well, again, you can learn more about the man and his legacy and the Tom Longboat Awards, amongst many other things, in Janice Forsyth Janice Forsyth, that's a mouthful, new book, Reclaiming Tom Longboat, Indigenous Self-Determination in Canadian Sport. Of course, you can find it online. We encourage you to go to your local bookstore and find it there. Janice, how can folks follow you or learn more about you and your work?
Well, I'm not on a lot of social media, but I do Twitter once in a while. So it's Janice at Western. And most of my posts are about Indigenous sport and sport in general. So you can find me there if you feel like doing social media.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual speaker series, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Great. Thanks so much, Kate. Good luck to you.
Thank you.